All right. So, hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Weilnhammer. I don't know if I say the last name correctly. Hope it's okay. Yeah. So Veit is a psychiatrist as well as a scientist, which is, like Steve already said before, mentioned when we were just chatting, that's quite a unique combination in consciousness research. So I think that's really, really cool. He did his medical training as well as his research doctorate in Berlin. He did his research doctorate with Philip Sterzer. And since 2013, he's also been associated with the Weizmann Institute in Israel. And his research focuses on predictive processing accounts of bistable perception, which he currently investigates as a postdoctoral researcher at Charité Universitätsmedizin Berlin, I think. And today he will talk to us about constructing ambiguous conscious experience from ambiguous sensory information. Yeah, take it away, Veit.
Naveen, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure and honor to be presenting here in the Consciousness Club. And as Naveen said, I would like to mainly talk about research that we've done in the lab on perceptual bistability and consciousness. And one of the main points that I'm interested in is how our brains generate unambiguous conscious experiences, even though sensory information is often very ambiguous. And as a psychiatrist, this is relevant to me because I believe that this is an important mechanism to understand, to get a better idea of why some people suffer from psychotic states of consciousness, for example, hallucinations where they see, hear, smell, feel things that are not there in reality. So it would be nice if I could say that my journey into consciousness research started with psychiatry, but the reality is different. It really started with science fiction anime. Just give me a second. Some trouble with the, now it's working. With a science fiction manga or anime, which is called The Ghost in the Shell. It's set in a very distant, very dystopian future, 2029, where humans merge more and more with machines, such that individual body parts are replaced by machine parts, or even the whole body is gradually replaced by machine parts. And the idea is that even though there is this machine component, this cyborg component, that there remains a remnant of biological tissue that is the host for consciousness and personality and is somehow irreplaceable. The main character, which you can see here on the slide, is called Motoko Kusanagi, and she's special because she believes that her whole body is synthetic. So she's a full machine, but she's still searching for her ghost in the shell in this story. And I'm really interested in this because I think it's a nice metaphor for many problems that we face in consciousness research. And I'm just going to outline 5 that I think are most relevant. The first one is the question of subjectivity. So because the brain of Motoko Kusanagi, the cyborg in the story, is all machine, it is very easy for us to understand all the mechanisms, all the things that happen, for example, when she has a conscious experience of, let's say, a watermelon. So it's very easy to have a complete mapping of what's happening at the time of this experience. However, for her, it's a subjective experience, it's a first-person experience, and it feels like something to experience the watermelon. And for us, when we look at her machine brain, then we have a third-person perspective on what she's experiencing. This gap has been called, as you know, the mind-body problem, or also the heart problem of consciousness. And maybe heart is even a euphemism, because to me, it often seems very difficult to squeeze the mental or the subjective out of the physical. But still, this is something that people think a lot about, and a very important question that is, I think, highlighted by this story of Motoko Kusanagi. It's also important for psychiatry, because usually when you have psychological phenomena, then people don't feel that this is something that comes from the brain. We usually experience this as something that exists in a different realm, and that makes it sometimes difficult to have a biological understanding for patients of why they, for example, hear voices when there are no voices there. I think in empirical research, still this mind-body gap is hard to bridge. So the ghost of this question is difficult to get at. However, I would argue that it's still important to better understand the biological shell of consciousness. And this is something, of course, you're all very well aware of, the search for the neural correlates of consciousness. So looking for the neural events that make the difference whether the stimulus is perceived consciously as opposed to unconsciously. Or in other words, the neural events that are jointly sufficient to generate a conscious experience. And an aspect of this search that is important to me is to understand, for example, in situations where sensory information is unreliable, ambiguous, or noisy, how does the brain generate these highly informative and unambiguous conscious experiences? What are the neural mechanisms that contribute to that? In relation, we don't know whether these mechanisms happen at the level of individual cells or groups of cells, whether you need multiple brain regions or even multiple brains to do this, to generate conscious experiences that are informative. If we understand this better, I think we can make progress on other highly relevant questions in the scientific study of consciousness, for example, regarding the function of subjectivity and conscious experience. So recently, in the recent years, I think we all have witnessed that machine learning algorithms can achieve really high proficiency on tasks that usually wouldn't be possible in machines just 20 or 30 years ago. However, they do this hopefully without any conscious experience so far. The question then is, what was the adaptive benefit of conscious experiences in the course of evolution? When did this emerge? Relatedly also, it's quite clear that there is conscious experience outside of the mammalian kingdom, beyond the human mind. So we know, I think, that cephalopods, so octopus, squid, cuttlefish, have conscious experiences. And when you go back at our last common ancestor, then this is just a sponge, I think, with a few neurons on the ocean floor. So it's quite obvious that consciousness developed several times in the course of evolution. And to understand this process and how different environmental conditions impact on how consciousness works or is experienced, I think is an important question that needs to be solved at some point in the future. And maybe on a last note, might be that at some point, conscious experiences also develop in artificial minds. And again, science fiction tells us that this is an important thing we need to prepare for, because someday we might at least have to interact with conscious artificial agents. So for today, what can you expect me to talk about? I will spend most of the time talking about the neural mechanisms of conscious experiences, and in particular, the neural mechanisms that generate unambiguous or informative conscious experiences in the light of ambiguous sensory information. Also going to talk a little bit about the scale of these conscious experiences and how they are generated, and a little bit about the function. This is going to be the part where I would like to talk a bit about psychiatry and some research we have done in patients suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. I will not talk about detecting conscious experiences outside of the human mind, and I'm also not going to talk about the very difficult problem of subjectivity. So the mechanisms of conscious experience, or the generation of unambiguous conscious experiences, how would you find them? The most naive way would be, let's say, to put a person inside an MRI scanner, and you would flash her pulses of light and instruct the participant to press a button whenever she has the experience of the flash of light. And what you might end up with could be a map that looks a little bit like this. Of course, all of you know that what you see here is not tantamount to the neural correlates of conscious experience. Why is that? So you flashed pulses of light, so every conscious experience is also correlated to sensory input and doesn't have to do anything with the mechanisms that, doesn't need to have anything to do with the mechanisms that cause conscious experience. Also, you instructed the participant to press a button whenever she has a conscious experience, so you're bound to find motor-related activity in this map. And maybe you are an experimenter that chooses long experimental designs, and maybe the participant was tired at some point and then less tired, and the arousal fluctuated. And when she was less attentive to the experimental task, maybe she didn't see really see or not really press the button when she had the flash of light. So you're also bound to find maybe the correlates of attention, which again are not the same probably as the neural correlates of consciousness. So what you need in the end then is a paradigm or a number of paradigms that allow you to dissociate the true neural correlates of consciousness from this multitude of alternative cognitive functions that occur up and downstream of the conscious experience. And I would argue that one way to do this is perceptual bistability. What is this? So bistable perception, usually you have visual stimuli in the lab that are ambiguous and that are compatible with two mutually exclusive sensory interpretations. So here on the left corner, you see the Necker cube that can be seen in two spatial orientations. So the view from above, the view from below. This is the Rubin's face-base illusion. So you either see a vase or two faces facing each other. This is apparent motion. So when you flash these two frames in succession, then observers will experience either vertical motion between the dots or horizontal motion between the dots. This is a special case called binocular rivalry. So you stimulate the two eyes independently of each other, and the left eye, let's say, sees this red grating, and the right eye sees the blue grating. And what you end up with is not purple, but you either see red, and then after some time you switch to blue, back and forth. All these stimuli, what they have in common is that you look at them for longer and you have spontaneous changes in what you really consciously experience, even though stimulus remains constant. Stimulus that we have used a lot in the lab is structure for motion stimulus, which looks a little bit like this. So here on the screen now you see an object, spherical object that's rotating around a vertical axis, and roughly 50% of you will see the front surface moving toward the left, and the other half is going to see the front surface moving toward the right. And the reason for this discrepancy is that what is really on the screen is not a 3D object that's rotating, but there are 2D dots that move in a way that they create the illusion of the 3D object that rotates. So it's compatible with both perceptual interpretations. You can either see leftward rotation or rightward rotation. If you look at this for longer, then you might see also spontaneous change in direction of rotation. So you might see first leftward rotation and later rightward rotation. So if anyone likes and has seen a switch, you can write it in the chat. We usually use a control stimulus in these experiments, which is a disambiguated version of this, and this will become important later. I'm showing it to you here. For you now, this is still ambiguous. It could go left or right, but if you look at this, maybe you can see it on my camera with these red-blue filter glasses. Then you will see that here there are always dot pairs, red-blue dot pairs, and they generate a 3D signal if you look at this through the glasses. And then I can control whether you see leftward rotation or rightward rotation. I can also make it switch. So I can basically have a similar conscious experience without the ambiguity. So again, to say, why is this relevant in the stimulus? It's always constant. You don't have any information about direction of rotation in the stimulus, but in the bistability condition, participants will see roughly every 20-25 seconds a change in direction of rotation. First, let's say you see leftward rotation, and then rightward rotation, leftward rotation, rightward rotation. And these events where there's a change in direction of rotation are often called switches or transitions. And the time in between when nothing changes, but the stimulus is going on, we also call it phase duration. So the time between two switches is the phase duration. So classically, people have looked at neural activity at the time point of these switches when perception changes. And what you see there is not only activity in visual cortex and feature selective regions of visual cortex, such as V5H-MT+, but also activity in parietal and prefrontal regions. This is also called the frontal-parietal network. And most consistently, there is switch-related activity in the inferior frontal cortex. This is a region that comprises the inferior frontal gyrus and the adjacent anterior insula. And in the literature, there's a debate about the significance, the functional significance of this IFC finding. So a number of people argue and have argued that basically these switches, when conscious experience changes, even though the stimulus is constant, these events are realized in visual cortex. So let's say in a feature selective region for motion, in this case, V5H plus. And the reason for the activity in the frontal and parietal regions is thought of as a consequence of this event that's related to, let's say, motor behavior, introspection, task switching, a number of downstream cognitive functions that might occur when you see this switch. There is the alternative view that the switches are realized in prefrontal cortex. So that this is the region where the brain makes up its mind about what is really on the screen, and there's a change in conscious experience, and some of this is fed back to a visual cortex, to V5H plus in the case of motion. And a third idea, a more homeostatic account, is a hybrid model that basically says that visual cortex detects perceptual conflict in the stimulus, the ambiguity, the amount of uncertainty, and this accumulates in a feed-forward process. So prefrontal cortex tracks the uncertainty, the perceptual conflict in the stimulus, and once this reaches a certain level, then there's a reinterpretation of the scene, and you change conscious experience. This is not the case for the discussion relates to bistable perception, but again, to make it clear, this is relevant for conscious experience in general, because uncertainty and ambiguity is not a phenomenon that is really only happening when I show you this artificial rotating cube or the sphere or the Necker cube, but it's a real life phenomenon. All sensory data are ambiguous, they're usually noisy and incomplete. So it's a task that we do all the time, but that gets exaggerated, or you can measure it when you use bistable perception because it's to its extreme than in the lab. When you go to models of perceptual bistability, there are many, but this is maybe just 3 flavors that often come up. So again, you have the stimulus here just as an icon, and you can see leftward and rightward rotation. The classic view is that there, let's say in V5H plus, maybe voxels that prefer leftward rotation and another population that prefers rightward rotation. And those populations are connected. They mutually inhibit each other. One of them wins at a point in time, but then slowly adapts over time until there is a switch and the other one becomes more active. And this leads to this oscillation between leftward and rightward rotation of the stimulus. Other models put more emphasis on noise. So they view this as an attractor landscape, and conscious experience is either the one or the other. And because there is some noise, at some point you go to the other part and you see the other interpretation of the stimulus. And of course, those two combine very well together because you can have a noise component also in this, let's say, oscillator view. The last one that has been influential to our work is the predictive coding or Bayesian inference view of bistable perception. And here the idea is that basically what you consciously perceive is a prediction about the most likely cause of sensory information. Let's say you believe the stimulus, or you implicitly believe the stimulus is turning toward the left, and you have this prediction that you combine with the incoming sensory data, which is of course compatible to some degree, but there's always residual evidence for the alternative because the stimulus is ambiguous. And this generates a prediction error that at some point leads to the switch to the other alternative. This is this predictive coding, or let's say Bayesian inference view on perceptual bistability. What we've done a few years ago is to build a simple algorithm that you can use to really fit this model to experimental data, where participants look at the bistable stimulus and indicate whenever they see a switch or they press a button according to whether they see leftward or rightward rotation. You fit this model and you generate an estimate, a quantity of the prediction error over time. It looks a bit like this. Just to repeat, so let's imagine you have the conscious experience of leftward rotation on the stimulus I've shown you. This is a prior belief about the most likely cause of sensory stimulation. It's unimodal. You combine it with the likelihood, which is bimodal and contains equivalent evidence for leftward and rightward rotation. And what you end up with is a bimodal posterior, which has more evidence for the currently dominant interpretation of the stimulus, but also residual evidence for the alternative. And this residual evidence for the alternative is, in our view, a prediction error that gradually weakens this prior over time, like so. And what you see here, I'm just going to go back and then forth again. So the process goes like this. The prior gets weaker, the posterior gets more balanced, the prediction error increases over time. And at some point, there's a switch to the other alternative, and the process is reinitialized. When you look at the bottom here, this is again over time. You see why the conscious experience is constant. The prediction error slowly goes up until it is reduced at the time of a change in conscious experience. So this model really understands switches during perceptual biostability as a means of prediction error minimization. You turn to a different interpretation because at this point in time, it has less prediction error and better explains the sensory data you have. You can combine this model or use it also for situations where there is sensory information. It doesn't only work for full perceptual biostability. How do we do it? This is called gradual ambiguity. The same stimulus for you now, you have to believe me, it's fully ambiguous. But if you look at this through these red-blue filter glasses, then something will happen. You see here on the screen purple dots, I hope. And those purple dots, they go through both filters the same. So they remain ambiguous. But the red-blue dot pairs, they carry a 3D signal. And what we do is we manipulate the amount of red-blue dot pairs in relation to the purple dots. The more of the red-blue dot pairs you have, the higher the signal to ambiguity ratio. And the higher the signal to ambiguity ratio, the more likely it is that your conscious experience of the stimulus is going to overlap or to be congruent with this sensory information that we put into the stimulus with these red-blue dot pairs. Okay. So imagine a situation where we have this gradual ambiguity and there's some degree of sensory information in the stimulus. If your current conscious experience is congruent with this sensory information, then prediction errors will be attenuated, shown here in blue. And that means that you will stay longer with this conscious experience, the switch is less likely. And conversely, let's imagine you have a conscious experience that is incongruent with the current sensory information. Then, of course, prediction errors are enhanced, shown here in red, and you will switch more quickly. So congruent, longer phase durations, incongruent, shorter phase durations, and this difference should be larger at higher signal to ambiguity ratios. What we've done is we ran two large MRI experiments on two independent groups of participants that looked at these stimuli indicated leftward, rightward rotation. And we fit these behavioral models to their behavioral responses and extracted the prediction error time course from these models. And then used this in model-based functional imaging, MRI, to look for the neural correlates of these prediction errors. And I'm showing you here always in blue experiment 1, and then the independent experiment 2 is shown in red. And here you see a map of the prediction error correlates in these two experiments. And what you can see is that there are two regions where there's consistent correlation to this modeled prediction error. One of them is V5HMT+, so the feature selective region for motion and visual cortex. Okay. And the other one is the inferior frontal cortex, a region that has consistently been shown to be activated at the time of switches during bistable perception. Here, of course, we're not looking exclusively at the switches, but we're looking at this ramp up of, let's say, prediction error related activity over time and its reduction after a switch in conscious experience. So this is just to say that prediction errors, this quantity, is expressed in these two regions, V5HMT+ and inferior frontal cortex. And it's tempting to speculate that maybe prior studies that have shown switch-related activity in these two regions, they just got the peak of this escalating prediction error and not the whole time course. If you look at this over time, this is how it looks like. Not surprisingly, the prediction error signal for the two experiments goes up, and then there is a switch in conscious experience, a change in conscious experience, and after that, with a lag of, let's say, 5 seconds, typical for fMRI, the signal goes down again. So there seems to be a gradual ramp up of activity and not only a switch-related activity at the time of the switch, basically. Because there were these two regions that now express the prediction error correlate, we asked whether it's more likely that the signal comes from the low-level region V5HMT+, or whether it comes from prefrontal cortex, from inferior frontal cortex. And to answer this question, we used a technique that I'm sure many of you know. It's called dynamic causal modeling. You build two competing models. In this case, a model where prediction errors are generated in V5HND+ and are fed forward to prefrontal cortex, and an alternative model where the prediction error is generated in inferior frontal cortex and is then fed back to V5HND+. You use this to try to explain the MRI data you have, and in the end, you compare the two models, the model evidence for each participant. And here, across the two experiments, consistently, we found that it was much more likely that the prediction error was generated in V5HND+ and was then fed forward to inferior frontal cortex. At least at the level of dynamic causal modeling, it seems that way. We then asked whether we could find a more specific root of this prediction error signal in visual cortex. And many studies had shown that you could, during perceptual bistability, use support vector classification, so decoding, to decode whether a participant would perceive leftward or rightward rotation, even though there's no sensory information and the stimulus is fully ambiguous, fully bistable. And this is a similar finding here. So we use the support vector classification algorithm to decode whether participants would see leftward or rightward rotation, again, for the two experiments. And consistently, we found that we could decode from visual cortex whether participants would see leftward or rightward rotation. It was also possible for, including, or it was possible in V5HND+. We weren't able to decode in prefrontal cortex, which may have a number of regions, but very consistently, we could decode from V5HND+. We therefore zoomed in on V5HND+ and selected voxels that would prefer or be more active during leftward rotation of the sphere and rightward rotation of the sphere. Okay, so voxel that's an L voxel is more active when participants experience leftward rotation of the sphere, and an R voxel is a voxel that's more active when participants perceive rightward rotation of the sphere. And then we checked whether these voxels would selectively express the prediction error at certain points in time. And what we found is, again, consistently across the two experiments, that voxels that are more active during leftward rotation encode the prediction error when participants perceive rightward rotation. Okay? And the other way around, a voxel that is more active during rightward rotation prefers rightward rotating stimuli would express the prediction error when the participant sees leftward rotation. So the prediction error signal seems to come from the voxels that encode the currently suppressed percept in V5HND+. And this is consistent with the idea of predictive coding, that basically the prediction error is the residual evidence for the alternative interpretation of the stimulus. So far, I've shown you in these two experiments that prediction errors during perceptual bistability activate V5HND+ and inferior frontal cortex. And it seems that the prediction error signal comes from the voxels that encode the currently suppressed content in V5HND+ and is then fed forward to prefrontal cortex. What I haven't shown you so far is, or haven't answered, is whether this prefrontal detection of perceptual conflict or ambiguity is relevant for conscious experience. And to this end, we ran a third experiment using theta burst TMS, using a neural navigation technique. So we had these maps for prediction errors for every participant out of the study, and invited them for a separate session of theta burst TMS. Theta burst TMS suppresses neural activity for approximately 30 minutes after the intervention. And we stimulated with neural navigation specifically at the site of maximum activation related to prediction errors in inferior frontal cortex for each participant, and vertex as a control condition. And we hypothesized that if there is the causal contribution of inferior frontal cortex to conscious experience, we should see longer phase durations after the IFC intervention with the TMS, because it would suppress this encoding of prediction errors in prefrontal cortex that's maybe relevant for conscious experience. And this is what we found, actually. So here on the y-axis, you see the post versus pre difference in phase duration. Positive values mean it takes longer to switch. And after IFC stimulation, phase durations were significantly longer. So this means we could suppress switching behavior to some degree, approximately 6 seconds on average, after theta burst TMS to inferior frontal cortex. We didn't find an effect on uncertainty. We didn't find an effect on response times. And we then asked whether the prediction error representation is somehow related to the strength of the TMS effect. And this is a simple correlation. So we checked whether the beta, the strength at which each individual represents prediction errors in inferior frontal cortex, correlates to the difference induced by the theta burst TMS intervention. And indeed, there was a positive correlation. Participants with a strong prediction error correlate in inferior frontal cortex have a stronger TMS effect in our paradigm. And to check whether this was specific to the inferior frontal cortex, we ran a whole brain searchlight support vector regression analysis. What does this mean? Basically, it means you look at patterns of both activity and you try to predict from them inter-individual differences in the TMS effect. And then you check whether it can do it significantly, correcting for the number of voxels in the brain. The only region where we could do this at Bonferroni correction significance is the inferior frontal cortex, so the anterior insula and the inferior frontal gyrus. So this really provides a strong link between the prediction error representation in inferior frontal cortex and the effect of this TMS intervention. So not an unspecific effect, but seems to be related to prediction errors. So to sum up, what I've shown you here is inferior frontal cortex not only detects perceptual conflict during perceptual bistability, but also contributes somehow to its resolution, because an inhibition of the region slows down the updating of perception. To zoom out again on the initial question, this somehow highlights that both visual cortex, V5HNT+, and inferior frontal cortex are implicated in constructing unambiguous conscious experiences from ambiguous sensory information. And inferior frontal cortex may have the function of regulating the access of conflicting sensory information into conscious experience. So this is basically the idea that we have behind this study, and we have now finishing to run a study that should confirm this with people who had strokes in inferior frontal cortex compared to people who had strokes also in frontal cortex, but not in the inferior frontal cortex. And then we are looking at differences in phase duration in a paradigm after that stroke, so 6 months after the stroke. And I'm hopefully being able to show these data soon, maybe at ASSC this year. To go on, how is this related to computational psychiatry? To introduce this, I would like to go to another, let's say, guilty pleasure of mine, which are computer games. And I want to highlight one computer game that I really like. It's quite recent. It's called The Last of Us 2. And I'm showing this to you here just to highlight how insanely detailed the graphics have become in the last 20 years of computer gaming. Many of you may know. So this is something that looks almost like you would be really walking through the snow. What is interesting to me here is not that the graphics are so great. I understand why this is happening, but when you do it on your machine, then you will maybe need something like at least 200, maybe 300, maybe 400 joules per second to run this on your normal computer. On the other hand, your brain, which generates even better conscious experiences, I would say, runs on 20 joules per second. So that's an order of magnitude lower, at least. And the interesting question is, why is there this difference? If you look at graphic cards or computers in general, you will find that information is processed for each frame individual. So if you have, say, 60 frames per second, then you will process each frame independently of each other. On the left, you see like an image of a build-it-at-home graphic card. And what you can take away from this is that information only flows in one direction. And this is also true for many models of the visual system, where information flows in one direction, from LGN neurons to simple cells, and then again, complex cells, they pool over simple cells. And somehow this travels up, information goes up, and it gets distilled into, let's say, a conscious experience. This is also borne out in many models of the visual system and in classification algorithms from the machine learning field, where information basically flows in one direction. However, if you look at the video game I just showed you, those are now individual frames, then you will realize that each frame has a lot of information for the upcoming frame. You can learn a lot about the upcoming frame just from knowing the frame before. So the frames are highly autocorrelated. The stream of frames is highly autocorrelated. And one way to use this, of course, would be to look at the predictive capacity of each conscious experience, each frame, to try to compress the amount of information you have to process, and thereby to compress the amount of energy you need to know to use to get high quality conscious experiences. This is shown here in this diagram. Each purple square here is a conscious experience, and it has some predictive value for the next. And this is basically how Bayesian inference vanilla works. So you would have a posterior belief, you generate a prediction, and what you actually perceive is not only the sensory input, but the combination of the two things, your prediction and actually the uncertain sensory information you have. And by that, you compress the amount of information you need to take in to do this. This becomes particularly relevant when sensory information is unclear. Then you can basically use this predictive capacity of preceding experiences to explain more about what is really on the screen, what is really around you. On the other hand, when you look at this diagram on the right, what you also see is that information flows in a circle here. So it might not be trivial to know whether it is your internal predictions that caused you to perceive something, or whether it's really in the sensory data. And this is a very, very, I think, interesting question, unresolved as far as I know, that is relevant to computational psychiatry, because of course, when information goes in circles, you might end up with a posterior belief that doesn't match reality anymore. This is an illustration of how this may happen. Let's say it's a signal detection situation. And if you look on the left, here there's log ratios, and in orange here, the log likelihood ratio. There's no stimulus present, log likelihood ratio -2. But you expect the stimulus to be there. That's here shown in green. Okay. If you use optimal Bayesian inference, and those are 3 consecutive time steps, and you just update your belief, then you see that the posterior, which is here in purple, moves closer to the likelihood. And at some point, you be very close to the likelihood and say, okay, no stimulus there, I'm sure. And you can do this, let's say, in a predictive coding network with a number of levels where you basically pass up prediction errors and you pass down predictions. And you can implement this sort of Bayesian inference and end up with the situation where you say, okay, there's no stimulus, even though initially I expected there to be a stimulus. However, 2 situations may lead you to have false alarms, to make the wrong judgment. First, let's say you overestimate the precision of your prediction. You're just too sure about there being a stimulus. And this might press your sensory information in conformity with your belief. This is shown here on the top, the time steps on the x-axis, and in purple you see just the evolution of the posterior. It just stays close to the prior, never goes down to the real true likelihood mean that you had. Okay. That's the strong prior situation, and it might cause you to hallucinate a stimulus when there's none there. Have a false alarm. The same thing again may happen for weak priors. So let's say there's some noise in the stimulus, and if you have very weak priors, then the posterior is going to fluctuate strongly with that noise. It's not going to stabilize, and you might end up in a situation where you cross your threshold for responding, yes, there is a stimulus. So both situations actually may give you false alarms. The question is, are hallucinations caused by overly strong priors, or are they caused by, let's say, weak priors? Too much a focus on noisy sensory information, or is it a combination of the 2 things? Where does this come from? This is an illusion I like. It's the hollow mask illusion. I'm sure you all know it. So you see a mask that is rotating around a vertical axis again, and now you look at the convex part of the mask, the outside of the mask, you see a convex face. I'm going to play this again. Now you look in the inside of the mask, but still you don't see a concave face, but you see a convex face reality. And this is interesting for computational psychiatry because it goes back to research by the Silverstein lab. I've shown that patients suffering from schizophrenia are less susceptible to the illusion. So they have it easier to see the convex inside of the mask as it really is, and not as we are not perceiving it as a convex face. Okay. To look at this more formally, again here, why does this happen? Why do we have this illusion? So there is stimulus information for a concave face when you look in the inside of the mask, but we have a strong prediction, I would say, that faces are not concave, they're usually convex. So there's a highly precise prediction about this anatomy of faces that is combined with the likelihood information, and you end up with a posterior, again here in purple, that's close to the convex situation, the normal face, not the concave face. Why would patients suffering from schizophrenia not have this illusion that strongly? So One idea is they're overly sensitive to the likelihood information. They're just very sensitive to sensory data, and that may be related to excessive dopamine signaling in the brain, very broadly speaking. And or alternatively, or at the same time, they may have weak predictions. So they may either not know how faces look like. I think that's unlikely, but maybe they can't use this knowledge for perception. And this is, let's say, imprecise priors that have also been related to NMDA receptor hypofunction in schizophrenia. This may give you a situation where the posterior is closer to the sensory information. We also wanted to check whether we could use our gradual ambiguity paradigm to test these two ideas. So is it that patients with schizophrenia are more or less susceptible to noisy sensory information in relation to priors? And just to remind you, this is the stimulus. Look at this with these red-blue filter glasses, and you have this signal to ambiguity ratio, which you can ramp up and down. The more of the signal to ambiguity ratio you have, the more likely you are to have a conscious experience that is congruent with the sensory information. Okay. What we've done is we compared a group of patients diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and a healthy control group. And what we did basically is we upregulated the signal to ambiguity ratio across 7 levels, shown here on the y-axis. What you expect is that when there's more sensory information, you're more likely to have congruent perceptual states. So conscious experience should be more likely to be congruent with the situation on the screen. And that's true for both groups, but we found a group by a signal to ambiguity interaction, meaning that patients were less able to detect the sensory information at baseline for low levels, but benefited more from upregulating the sensory information. And we refer to this here as the sensitivity to sensory information. The interesting thing was that patients were more sensitive to this noisy and ambiguous, partially ambiguous sensory information, were more likely to have perceptual anomalies as measured by the CUPS, and more likely to have clinical hallucinations as measured by the P3 item of the PANSS, suggesting maybe that patients who are very, let's say, prone to following noisy sensory information that is on the screen are more likely to hallucinate. That's interesting because actually at higher levels, patients have a better performance than controls here. So it's not related to a general, let's say, problem with performance on the task. They're actually doing it better at higher levels of signal to ambiguity ratio. So some correlation evidence in favor of this, let's say, weak prior account. However, fully aware of the fact that there are many different ways to measure hallucinations and to do this, and this is an unresolved issue, whether also strong priors can cause hallucinations and whether there's different types of hallucinations that relate to different alterations is in this, let's say, mechanism of predicting and generating prediction errors. However, because I just showed you in the study before, that prefrontal cortex may regulate the access of conflicting information into conscious experience. And here we found that this is different for patients with paranoid schizophrenia. One idea is that maybe transcranial magnetic stimulation of the inferior frontal cortex may modulate hallucinations in this population. So this is something we would like to do in a follow-up study that's on the way, hopefully soon. We've also done is we used ketamine now in a placebo-controlled in a placebo-controlled trial with ketamine infusion and placebo infusion within participants to really modulate the feedback signaling during this task. And also here, I'm hopefully being able to share the results of this experiment soon, but we're trying basically to reproduce the finding in patients with this ketamine intervention. So just a brief interim summary, the second of 3 interim summaries now. I've shown you that we can find differences between patients suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and healthy controls with regard to the regulation of access of conflicting information into conscious experience. So when you take a paradigm that you use to study the generation of unambiguous conscious experiences from ambiguous sensory information, you find differences between patients and controls in the direction that patients are more sensitive to this noise and to the ambiguity in the sensory signal. And this may point to different ways to study hallucinations in the future to better understand their biological basis. A last point, this is more ongoing work where we're speculating about this this difficulty I've alluded to just a few slides ago about the circularity here. So because information in this, let's say, context can flow in circles, it's difficult to know whether errors you make are caused by relying too strongly on your internal predictions or by relying too strongly on noisy sensory information. So the question is, how do you know what contributes to what degree? And how do you balance the two against each other? And what we did is basically was serendipity. We did a study using this stimulus. It's very similar again. So here you have also like this cylindrical object, and it's with blanks, but you can see leftward and rightward rotation of this object. And again, you see our signature paradigm now, gradual ambiguity. You have these purple dots, and you have the red blue dot pairs, and we manipulate the amount of red blue dot pairs or signal to ambiguity ratio. And what we really try to do here, when you use these bistable stimuli and you put blanks in between, then you usually stabilize conscious experience. You reduce the amount of switches. And the question was, can we find the equivalent amount of sensory information we need to counterbalance this stabilization of the conscious experience by the blanks? So by interleaving the stimulus, to somehow have this measure of how strong it is in individual participants. And we did this by basically doing a staircase procedure, increasing or decreasing the signal to ambiguity ratio depending on how many switches participants would indicate in like a window of time of this experiment. And here on the bottom plot, you can see that when you ramp up the signal to ambiguity ratio, you're more likely to get congruent perceptual states. And because the stimulus information was almost random, so always random, sorry, we try to get at like a 75% signal to ambiguity, so a signal to ambiguity ratio, sorry, that would give us 75% stimulus congruence in this paradigm. This was done over a number of runs. And you can see here with the staircase, reducing or increasing the signal to ambiguity ratio, depending on the amount of congruent conscious experiences, we somehow approached 80–75% in this paradigm. We were quite happy that it was at least possible to balance the two factors against each other. But then I looked at the time course of the data and found something surprising, because the effect wasn't constant. So there were prolonged periods where participants would just stick with the history effect, just repeating their choices, seeing the same thing over and over. And then at some point, there was quite a hard switch to a different mode, I'm now calling it, where they closely followed the sensory information, meaning that otherwise effective, this was an effective amount of sensory information, was ineffective for prolonged periods of time, and then became effective at another time. Okay. So this is shown here in a different way. Those are autocorrelations for stimulus congruence, so doing it well, getting the stimulus right, and history congruence being driven by your predictions that come from the sequence of preceding experiences. And those are highly autocorrelated. So if you know that one trial is a history congruent trial, you know that it would be like this for a bunch of trials, even though stimulus information is effective. And the same for stimulus congruence. Okay? So there seems to be a period where perception is closer to the input and largely ignores predictions. And there seems to be a time where it's the other way around. And this reminded us of the wake-sleep algorithm a little bit, no? Where you go and you either focus on one or the other direction of flow of information in a network to make it more stable. And we're now investigating whether this could be a way of really finding out how reliable internal and external contributions to conscious experience are. Because if you focus more strongly on one, then errors are, of course, more informative about one of the two. And this is an idea that we're now pursuing in a bunch of experiments. We did check whether this is a general phenomenon or whether it only occurs in this very special experiment we have. And to this end, we did like a large-scale open data analysis using the confidence database. So we selected out of this database only studies for binary perceptual decision-making in vision, and found again that there is a history effect. So people have some sort of propensity to repeat the choices. And this is autocorrelated. So it means you stick in this history mode for longer. And also the probability of getting the stimulus right, being accurate, being stimulus congruent is also autocorrelated, much as in the study I've just shown you before. And of course, this is important to us because it was done on like 22 million choices now, and the same for the IBL database. So we check whether this is also in mice, and they also have this really nice and impressive open data set for mouse perceptual decision making. We selected those trials from a specific subset of this analysis. So basically a situation where mice made perceptual decisions between two stimuli that were balanced and equally likely. And again, here we found strong autocorrelations in history congruence and stimulus congruence, much as in humans. And so the idea is to pursue this also in relation to metacognition, and how this may improve our ability to estimate how reliable, let's say, predictive information from preceding experiences is in relation to how reliable sensory information is that comes from the stimulus. So with this, I would like to sum up and just say again, I've shown you 3 sets of experiments. The first one looks really at the role of prefrontal cortex in perceptual biostability. And we argue that these experiments suggest that prefrontal cortex plays a role in regulating the access of conflicting information into conscious experience. I've shown you one study on patients with paranoid schizophrenia, where we point to a difference in the regulation of access of conflicting information into conscious experience between patients and controls. And lastly, I've shown you more explorative and let's say speculative ideas about perceptual modes, external and internal modes that may contribute to getting reliable estimates of the precision or the precision of internal and external sources of information in conscious experiences or perceptual decision making. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention. And just here, those are a bunch of papers that I've been referring to in the talk, and you will find this talk on my website, where you can click through the slides and look at it again if you want to, find links to the papers I referenced so that you can, if I got you interested, that you can read up on this. But yeah, thanks a lot for having me, and I'm very, very happy to hear your questions.
Thanks so much for the awesome talk. So let's everybody unmute and give Veit a really big round of applause. Ooh. Yeah, this was really, really interesting. We're gonna start the Q&A session.